is a historic, it's going to be a historic, all of them are, but this one is the most historic since 1968, anyhow, as we are in for some major, major changes. But conferences aren't new for Methodists. In fact, we are celebrating, we probably won't have a lot of celebrations, but we will mark 280-year anniversary of the first conference that John Wesley called in 1744 in London at the Foundry. And they raised three questions. What shall we teach? How shall we teach? And what shall we do? And those have been the underlying questions of all of our conferences, or they should be. Now, they spent, and there were only 6, as I recall, and they were clergy, and it wasn't democratic. John Wesley ran the meetings, gave the questions and most of the answers. But we have been in conferencing ever since. Now, General Conference is different from the annual conference, although they are related. We are a church in conferencing. Do we have the slide for the, you have on the back of your handout, it doesn't show very well simply because of the size of the document I sent, to give you some indication of how we are connected. This is one graphic of the structure and organization of the United Methodist Church. And you will find the largest circle in there is the General Conference, and all of the other conferences have some relationship to the General Conference. I like the way this particular graphic expresses it because it puts the General Conference at the bottom of the diagram and everything comes kind of out of it. But the top of the diagram, what's the top? You see it? It's the local church. So the local church, whereas I'm afraid that in our historical development as a denomination, we have tended to move the connectionalism from the horizontal, the local, to the vertical. And we tend to see General Conference up here, and then Annual Conference, and then District Conference, and then Charge Conference. In other words, we have reversed it, I think, as to what connectionalism really meant in the early church. In the early Methodism. For John Wesley, it was class meetings, bands, societies, and healthcare ministries. All of these were connected in a local communities. And even some of us who are, well, I see a few that are my generation or close, most churches were on circuits, or we were part of sub-districts. For example, in my own experience, my church that I grew up in as a Methodist, after I became a Methodist, about 11 years old, we were on a circuit, and we had the local church, the circuit, youth group. We had our local church group that had about 12 in the youth group. Then we had a circuit youth group, and then we had a sub-district youth group. Then we had a district youth group. Then we had a conference youth group. And I met my wife at that time in a conference youth groups. So anyhow, that's just to say we are a connectional church, and we have evolved into more of a vertical connectionalism. But I think what's happening now and much of it not desirable, but with disaffiliations and getting less dominant in the culture, we may be moving back toward more of a horizontal connection. and the need to connect horizontally. How many of you are from Washington Street? Oh, well, that's about all of you. Some from other, you got some? Which churches are you from? Asbury? Shandon? Mount Hebron? Any others? Salem? Well, you see, we are doing what we hope will happen down the road. We'll have more of these kinds of gatherings where local churches get together to supplement, complement, and mutually support one another. But we're here this afternoon to talk about General Conference. Now, the purpose of the session is more of an overview, as I've understood it from your pastors, is more of an overview of what General Conference is, what its powers are, how it's structured, and some of the formal and informal things that take place at General Conference. Look at some of the issues that are before this particular General Conference, and then how we might impact General Conference. Is that your understanding of why we're here? The purpose is not to debate the issues. We don't have time for that, at least to go into any detail of the debate, and to give detailed information about all the issues, because they're too multiple. Almost all of these groups that were on that slide are bringing petitions to the General Conference from local churches, from individuals, from agencies, and other parts of the connection. And so there are 1,099, I believe, official petitions before this General Conference. And I would not dare claim to know the details of any of them, but much less more than 1,000 of them. But you know, you can go read all of them if you're interested. Just go to the General Conference website, and it's listed, you'll see it a little later in the presentations. You can go on that website, and you can download, if you like, from the daily or from the Christian Advocates, you can download those petitions and read them and see what's before the General Conference. But let me just, first of all, talk a little bit about the General Conference, its powers and its structures, before we get to the issues that are coming before and how General Conference works. Now, I was a delegate. My first General Conference to attend was in 1984. So I've been to a few General Conferences, and it's a voluminous task. Any delegates here? You've been a delegate, John, I know. Are there any of the persons who are listed? You have those listed, the current delegates from the South Carolina Conference are listed on your handout. See those? But I didn't know whether any of them were here or not, but John Culp has been to several and led the delegation from South Carolina, I know, in some quadrennia. So, looking at the General Conference, what is General Conference? It's defined in both the Constitution, and it's in the general, anything in here comes from the General Conference. And this is the Book of Discipline. You can add volume 2 to this, and that would be the Book of Resolutions. It's thicker than this. But the Book of Resolutions and the Book of Discipline come out of the General Conference. They're produced by the General Conference. But specifically, the General Conference has full legislative power over all matters distinctively connectional. That is, all matters that relate to our connectional polity comes out of under the powers and authority of the General Conference. Only the General Conference can speak for the United Methodist Church. So if anyone says something and say, the United Methodist Church believes this, or this is the position of the United Methodist Church, if it isn't in the discipline or the book of resolutions, if the General Conference has not approved it, you don't speak for the United Methodist Church. An administrative council can take a position that may be contrary to the book of discipline, but they have to say, this is from the administrative council of such and such church. Only the General Conference can speak for the United Methodist Church. So it consists, or its duties include the revising of the book of discipline and the book of resolutions. I think the book of resolutions, I didn't bring it with me, it's over 700 pages, and its positions on various issues confronting society. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So that's the power of the General Conference is legislative and administrative. It also approves, of course, the doctrinal statements and so forth, and we can get into that. And I want to say up front, there are no petitions that I'm aware of that call for the changing of our doctrine. So there's a lot of disinformation circulating that the United Methodists have changed their beliefs. That is not accurate. The core doctrine of the United Methodist Church is constitutionally protected under restrictive rules and can only be changed by a constitutional amendment that would require not 2/3 but 3/4 of the approval of all annual conferences across the denomination. Changing the doctrine of the United Methodist Church is near impossible. That is the doctrinal standards. The articles of religion, confession of faith, are protected by our restrictive rules. So anybody who says the United Methodist has changed its doctrine and no longer believe in the Trinity, or no longer believe in the divinity of Jesus, no longer believe in the authority of Scripture, it's not true. We've got some United Methodists who don't believe that, but we don't. The United Methodist Church holds fast to those doctrines. Membership of the General Conference and how they're selected. The membership is determined by the discipline. It's a maximum of 1,000, a minimum of 600. The number at this next General Conference is 862 delegates based on membership and of clergy and congregations. But the voting members, equal number of lay and clergy. They are elected by the annual conferences the year prior to the General Conference. This General Conference is different. It is really not the 2024 General Conference. It's the 2020 General Conference. It's the first time it's happened. The General Conference of 2020 was postponed because of, and here's more disinformation. Some have said it was done out of some kind of conspiracy theory. It was done because of COVID and the inability of the delegates outside, particularly outside the U.S., to get passports to attend the conference. But the discipline, it's made up of equal number of lay and clergy from all of the annual conferences. They are elected from those eligible inside the annual conferences. And they're to meet every 4 years. And since we couldn't meet in 2020, this really is the 2020 General Conference. That sounds strange, and it is, and it was controversial. The Judicial Council ruled that it would be the adjourned session or the delayed session of the 2020. So, I listed the number of the percentage of delegates because one of the trends that's happening in General Conference is, since it's based on membership of clergy and lay members of conferences, we're growing in Africa and in the Philippines as a denomination. We're declining in America and Europe, particularly in America, in membership. So the percentages are shifting. And you have the percentages of the 862 delegates at the forthcoming General Conference. Almost 56% are from the U.S., 32% are from Africa, 6% from the Philippines, and 4.6% from Europe, and then the others, which are a few, just to a dozen or so, are from a concordant denomination, like those with whom we have agreements, like the British Methodist. We'll have a delegate or two there. Okay, South Carolina has been, they're assigned 8 clergy, 8 laity. So there will be 16 delegates from South Carolina attending and voting at the General Conference coming up in Charlotte. Those are elected, as we said, by the clergy elect clergy, the laity elect laity. Clergy don't vote for the lay delegates, and lay delegates don't vote for the clergy delegates. And anyone who is clergy can be elected, and any of the lay persons, that they must be members of the United Methodist Church, and they must have been members for, I may be corrected on this, at least 2 years, I think it is. John was elected. John, how were you elected? Did they just start voting for you? It's the way it begins, isn't it? You just start voting. Who is it that you want to represent you to the annual conference? And people vote until you get 60% of the votes. And that's laity and clergy. And you just keep voting until you get the 8 elected. 8 clergy, 8 laity. Any questions about the voting or about who's elected? John, you want to make a comment? Okay. Yes, you have to be a United Methodist to be a delegate too. And what's happened in this General Conference, some who disaffiliated or left the denomination, the Judicial Council has ruled they have to be replaced. And they were replaced by reserve delegates, or an annual conference could elect their replacements if they chose to do so. So those who have left the denomination and joined another denomination are not eligible to be voting members. Some may be present, but they can't vote. Okay. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes. The question is. Yeah. Now go ahead and ask it again, Bill, and it'll get on in the live streaming. Now you got it.
Got a low-tech preacher in a high-tech church here. Okay. Since this is going to be the 2020 session, will there be a 2024 General Conference, or will it just be relabeled down the line, or will we just skip 24? What are they going to do?
Well, there is a petition coming. There is a recommendation coming. In fact, I think it's already, the Council of Bishops is going to call a special session in 2026.
I see. Thank you.
Then there will be one in 2028. But electing these delegates is very important, and it needs to be taken seriously by when you elect your member of the annual conference from your local church to represent you. Those are the ones who voted for these delegates. So your lay member is the lay member of the annual conference from Washington Street here. Okay, well, you had a delegate at South Carolina Conference that voted for the lay delegates, and your pastors voted for the clergy delegates. So local churches are the ones who send their representatives to elect these delegates. So these are duly elected at the local level. Okay, the General Conference organization, you have the structure, but at the General Conference itself, there is a General Commission on the General Conference. It's the one, for example, who makes the recommendations about and works through the locations, where it's the logistics of where do we have the conference. And they're the ones who also recommended, they're the ones who process credentials. They're the ones who make possible the letter or send out the letters of invitation to the delegates outside the U.S. so they can apply for visa or passport to get into the U.S. for this meeting. So there's a commission on the General Conference, and they work between conferences in planning the overall logistics of the General Conference. But there are also other committees. There is a committee on the agenda, like you have in the annual conference. There's a committee on presiding officers that decides who's going to preside. Now, they decide on which bishop is going to preside, because the bishops are the ones who preside at the General Conference. And that is basically their only function at General Conference, is they are the presiding officers. They do participate in worship. Bishops do not control the General Conference, except the parliamentary process. Bishops have no vote, and they don't even have a voice at the General Conference to speak on an issue unless they're granted that voice, if that makes sense. If someone says, we'd like for Bishop Holston to speak on this issue, the chair, whoever is presiding, will say, will the conference grant Bishop Holston the permission to speak on this issue? Now, they can speak in worship. In fact, the worship services, most of the time, the bishops are preaching at the worship services. But there are just the committees you would think would need to be for a large meeting like this. Those are part of that. The Council of Bishops is there. Active and retired are seated at the General Conference. They're usually seated up front. We usually refer to ourselves as the potted plants. And this is being live streamed. Maybe I better not tell everything. But one of the worries is you get out of line of the cameras because you don't want to get caught sleeping. But as I said, the bishops preside. Now, they may have a backup bishop who might be retired, backing up the bishop who is presiding, but only the active bishops preside. Then you have also present at the General Conference the Judicial Council. You see, the General Conference is the legislative branch. It's no accident that we came into existence at the same time the federal government was coming into existence. And for good or ill, we have some of the same patterns, and sometimes we act like the federal government. But the General Conference is the legislative branch. Council of Bishops is the executive branch, and Judicial Council is the judicial branch. And all three are present at the General Conference, so that if an issue rises that is questionable whether this will be constitutional, then it can be referred to the Judicial Council, and they can meet and come back and render a verdict on whether this is constitutional. So they are there, the Council of Bishops and the legislative delegates. But the General Conference is organized into the primary basic nitty-gritty work is done by legislative committees. And just like the American Congress, bills go before a committee before it comes out to the plenary session. So all of those petitions, those 1,099 petitions, will go to, they'll be parceled out according to subject to one of the 14 legislative committees. And every legislative petition has to be dealt with. And everyone will be seen by a committee. And then will be, depending on what happens, and the legislative committees meet primarily during the first week of the General Conference. And it's hard work, isn't it, John? They usually are working late at night, trying to work through these petitions, because every petition has to be dealt with. It can be proposed, amended, substituted for, brought together, but all of those petitions have to be dealt with, and they're dealt with in legislative committees. Those legislative committees are made up, again, equal number of lay and clergy, and delegates. Annual conferences usually either they assign their delegates to particular committees. Which committee did you serve on, John? Okay. Well, I've served on a couple of legislative committees during my time as a delegate. But it's hard work. You go through, that's where the nitty-gritty of the legislation takes place. It would be interesting if I don't know how these delegates from South Carolina, where they are assigned in committees. But if you've got a particular issue, the appropriate person to contact would be your representative on that legislative committee would be a good person to contact. Now, one of the unique things about of those 1,099, about 300 of them, I understand, were submitted by either congregations or persons who are no longer, or they were submitted to the 2020 General Conference, and they are no longer members of the United Methodist Church. Are legislative committees obligated to deal with the petitions presented by someone who is no longer a United Methodist, or if it was presented from a church that's no longer United Methodist, do they need to consider that petition? That hasn't been determined, but that will probably be voted on right up front in the General Conference, because the legislative committees will need to decide, will need to know, do we need to deal with this petition or don't? So this number may be reduced from the 1,099 down by a few hundred. Let me just, they can originate anywhere. Let me just give very quickly one illustration of how a petition is dealt with at General Conference and where they come from. I was a pastor of Church Street United Methodist Church in Knoxville, Tennessee, and a member of a couple in that church came to me one day and said, Powell, and they give me permission to share this story, by the way, Powell Richardson. Powell was born, when he was born, he had severe brain damage at birth. And he was now approaching the age of whether to be confirmed or not. And so his mother and father, his mother is an attorney, now a judge, but is an attorney, and she had said, can Powell be confirmed? And she had asked some pastors in the area, and 2 or 3 of them that she had asked said, well, no, he really can't be confirmed because he can't assume the vows of church membership, because the discipline specifically said that when they have accepted the appropriate vows. Well, Powell was incapable of accepting for himself, which the discipline required, for himself the vows of church membership. He cognitively could not comprehend, nor could he verbalize. So, can he be confirmed? I said, sure, I will confirm him. And I could give you my reasons, but that's a different subject. But some pastors had told her no. Because, well, what happens to him? Well, he is a baptized member. Well, what happens when he becomes, when he's grown, when he's, beyond childhood? And this one pastor said to her, not the pastor of that church, by the way, it was another pastor she had asked, well, they go into the constituency role. Well, what's the constituency role? This pastor used the wrong words to a loving parent who was also an attorney. Said, well, that's the dog pound of church membership. So Mary Ella said, my son is not going to be in anybody's dog pound. So she said, I said, well, I have no problem theologically or any other way of confirming Powell. She said, but I want to make sure no other parent has to have that decision. She said, how do we change that? I told her the process. We can submit a petition to General Conference to add a paragraph in the discipline, to add to the paragraph on church membership the provision that due to any disabilities or lack of abilities, the vows may be assumed by the parents, committed members of the church, and the congregation may repeat the vows on behalf of the person. So, I was a delegate to General Conference. They took that petition to the Administrative Council of Church Street. The Administrative Council said, let's send it from the church. Then they said, well, let's send it to the Holston Annual Conference and see if they will endorse it. Send it to the Holston Annual Conference. They endorsed it. It went to the General Conference. I was a delegate. I followed that petition. I got its number, and I followed it all the way through the legislative process until and I went into the legislative committee that was dealing with it and asked permission to speak on behalf of the petition and told Powell's story. It was approved unanimously by the legislative committee. It went to the General Conference floor, and it went into the the consent calendar is what I'm trying to think of. it had no opposition in the legislative committee, so it became law, and it's in the book of discipline. Did I put the paragraph in there? Yes. If you wanted to look it up, you can look at the paragraph that it went in. You can do that on any issue. And so many of these issues have arisen out of personal concerns. Now, let me quickly, I'm spending too much time on these nitty-gritty, right? I don't want to. You want me to move on quickly? Okay. And the plenary, the first week then is spent largely in legislative committees, working long hours, doing amending, and then those come out in the second week. That doesn't mean that they can't be brought out at other times. If a committee requests, we really need this to be acted upon. They could go before the committee on the agenda and say, could we put this in the agenda before next week? And it be dealt with earlier. So as it comes before the as it comes to the plenary consists of worship service. Every day begins with worship, usually led by bishops. At least the bishops are preaching. They have guest choirs, but it's usually very wonderful high points of the service every day. But all kinds of activities take place around the plenary as well as within the plenary session. But the major part of the plenary, the second week, is dealing with all this legislation. A lot of unofficial activities taking place in addition to legislation. There are celebrations by various agencies, institutions, advocacy groups. There's lobbying going on all the time. On your way to the delegates, on your way to the general or to the sessions, you're going to have people handing you leaflets or coming up to you and asking you, please deal with this, or please vote this way. So all that's going on over to the side. Well, let's look then at the General Conference. Do you have any questions about how it operates? I don't want to get down in the weeds of how it operates. Watching my time here. Any questions about nothing on thus far? On the okay, you'll let me know. Okay. Okay, good. Okay, as we said earlier, if we move now from how the conference operates, and General Conference is a combination, well, like annual conference, it's kind of a combination of homecoming. There are lots of celebrations. You see people you haven't seen. One of the great things about General Conference is we are a global church, and we've got all those cultures represented. And by the way, there are, I think it's 4 languages of the official languages of the General Conference, but there are translators translating to all of the languages of the delegates that are there. So no one is without a translator from outside the U.S. I know it's English, French, Portuguese, and one of the African languages, I believe, that are. I don't know the budget of the annual conference. I've heard the figure around $10 million that it costs to do the General Conference. Anybody else heard others? I haven't seen the budget, but it's costly when you're bringing people from all over the world, and that's one of the questions being raised. Can we afford a meeting every 4 years of delegates from all over the world? That right now it's required in our Constitution to have a meeting every 4 years, but that relates to one of the issues coming before the conference in Charlotte, and the dates of that are April 23 through May the 3rd up at Charlotte. One of the issues top on the agenda is regionalization, and that is a sea change. It will be a historic change. It will require some constitutional amendments. But that is to make the U.S. a central conference, or similar to the central conferences in Africa and the Philippines and Europe. That's right now. Certain parts of the discipline will apply to all regions, all conferences. Parts 1 through 3 of the discipline, or is it 1 through 4? I don't have the numbers in front of me. But the doctrine, the social principles, the Constitution, and ministry of all Christians, that covers all of the conferences. But some of the administrative parts of the discipline are subject to change by those conferences. If it doesn't meet in that particular context, that conference can have an alternative to what's maybe in this book of discipline. So they can write some parts of their own discipline. The U.S. has not had that option. This would mean, the regionalization would mean that the U.S. would be similar to the conferences in Africa, Asia, and Europe, to where they could have some parts of the discipline that would be unique to the U.S., or would enable the U.S. to focus on U.S. issues that may not have relevance for the African context. One of the complaints from some of the African bishops, to me, even in the Council of Bishops, is that we're too U.S. centered. You set the agenda for us. We want to help set the agenda, and we want the agenda set for ourselves. Regionalization would mean that the U.S. would have the same, would be on the equal footing with these other central conferences. And parts of the discipline would be focused specifically on the U.S. and not applicable to Africa and Europe. Do you understand that? Is that clear enough? Now, the devil or the angels are in the details. And I don't know all the details. And in fact, I don't think all the details have been worked out, because that's a new way of doing things. But we have been U.S.-centric. We pay the largest percentage of the budget by far. But now with the increase in the number of delegates from outside the U.S., and by 2 quadrennium, the U.S. will be the minority. The majority of delegates will come outside the U.S. within 2 quadrennia, maybe sooner than that, because of the growth, where the growth and the changes, and especially with disaffiliations and the closings, we're getting even smaller. So it makes it all the more urgent that we not try to control the whole universe from the U.S. perspective. So regionalization will be central. Now you can look, I gave the website that you can go and read in more detail the regionalization legislation that's coming. Any comment or question about regionalization? Okay, another major issue before the General Conference will be the new social principles. The social principles that are in the Book of Discipline, in 2012, there was a suggestion, and it came partly from and largely from outside the U.S., that these social principles are again U.S.-centric, and not globally centered. So they called for a revision of the social principles. And those social principles have been in the process of revision for 8 years. A committee was formed to develop new social principles. And that committee did hearings across the globe to get input from wide spectrum of people, U.S. and outside the U.S., on various issues related to societal concerns. And that new document is now ready for presentation to the General Conference. It's been widely distributed, and one of the hot button issues that I know Washington Street has particular important concerns about is what about the language related to LGBTQ persons? The new social principles remove that part of the social principles that says homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. Do you know how that got in there? That was not in the original social principles presented in 1972 after we merged with the Evangelical United Brethren Church. The General Conference of 1968 asked that a new social principles be developed for this new denomination called now the United Methodist Church. A committee was appointed to develop the social principles. It was chaired by a native South Carolinian. Anybody want to guess who that was? One of my heroes, James Thomas. Bishop James Thomas was the chair of the committee to develop the new social principles for the United Methodist Church. They presented those social principles to the General Conference plenary session. An amendment came to the floor, moved by, I know the delegate's name, I've met him, he's a delegate for many subsequent General Conferences, moved the insertion of that phrase that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. And it went through by a narrow vote. That's how that got in there. It didn't come from the Legislative Committee on Social Principles. James Thomas did not have that in the social principles. It came from the floor. So just the fact that these new social principles recommend the removal of that language, the new social principle, I brought it with me, the statement on human sexuality, if you're interested in reading it, or my reading it. It doesn't include that statement. But that doesn't mean it will be removed, because it can be amended on the floor or in legislative committees. Let's get the mic here.
All of the petitions that are up there now, they also have to go through a legislative committee, right? Is that,
yes.
That's my understanding?
Yes.
And so those legislative committees are made up from the global.
You have delegates.
You have
on
delegates
the legislative committees.
From each area in the
Yes.
global. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Now, you see, South Carolina has 16 delegates, so they can have a member of every committee. There are 14 committees. Some conferences don't have enough delegates to have someone on every committee, but there will be representatives from U.S. and I'm sure, and some of the delegates outside don't have enough to have on every legislative committee. Okay. did you want me to read that statement? Is that of interest to you? Here's the proposal coming, and you can go on the website and download this yourself and read it later. But we affirm human sexuality as a sacred gift and acknowledge that sexual intimacy contributes to fostering the emotional, spiritual, and physical well-being of individuals and to nurturing healthy sexual relationships that are grounded in love, care, and respect. Human sexuality is a healthy and natural part of life that is expressed in wonderfully diverse ways from birth to death. It is shaped by the combination of nature and nurture, heredity and genetic factors on the one hand, and childhood development and environmental on the other. We further honor the diversity of choices and vocations in relation to sexuality, such as celibacy, marriage, and singleness. We support the rights of all persons to exercise personal consent in sexual relationships, to make decisions about their own bodies and be supported in those decisions, to receive comprehensive sexual education, to be free from sexual exploitation and violence, and to have access to adequate sexual health care. That's the statement. It's shorter because the one that was in the previous, or that's in the current social principles, got added to over time. Added to such phrases as celibacy and singleness, and fidelity of marriage. Those kinds of. This is somewhat more general language, but it's what's going before the committee. How it will come out to the plenary and what the plenary does to it will be questioned. Will unknown. Yes, another question back here.
This is a political question. The Central Conference can vote,
Yes.
and that's how we did in the regional. They're going to be regional, and the discipline won't apply to some of the social principles that we adopt. But they can still vote on this particular issue.
Yes.
You have no idea how they're going to vote.
No.
And
No,
that
every delegate,
every
will have a
delegate from
vote
the
on
central,
this issue.
every
All
delegate,
862 will have a vote on this issue.
yeah.
Well, if it comes out, whatever the committee brings out, anything can happen. Yes, back in the back, Austin.
You may not be able to answer this, Bishop Carter, but have I not heard something where there's a possibility that we would vote on regionalization up front? Because that we would vote on regionalization up
Yes.
front so that it wouldn't be such a dogfight about some of the terminology and the social principles, because each conference could choose to do some of their own stuff with social principles?
If we vote on regionalization, the regionalization could not take effect until after it's been constitutionally approved, because it requires some constitutional changes. But all legislation takes effect in January after the General Conference, unless it's specified that it takes place immediately. But I don't know how the there's the assumption that delegates from outside the U.S., delegates from the African context specifically, because there is a different attitude toward this in the many African cultures. However, I don't think we can assume that the African delegates are going to vote to retain the present language. I don't want us to assume that. That's they get blamed for defeating it. But there were enough U.S. delegates who voted for the current language that could override, and new delegations have been selected since the 2019 debacle. The legislation that was approved in the called session of the General Conference in 2019. Part of the reaction to that was the selection of different delegates for this conference. So I'm less anxious about that. Another one back here.
So are you saying if they voted on the regionalization and then they voted for the new social principle about that you read, that the African and the other regions, whatever, would not have to adopt that? Is that what you're saying? That only the U.S.?
It would still be a part of the discipline that the African. See, the social principles social principles are not they are not juridical.
Oh.
They're not and neither are they doctrinal. They are and the preamble to the social principles says these are teaching resources. They are aspirational resources. They are where the church stands at this juncture. They are live living. And that's where we get confused. This is not doctrine. This is how the General Conference or some committees perceive that the doctrines can be applied in this generation, in this time. But these are subject to change every 4 years, and they only require majority vote. So they are not doctrine. Neither are they legislative positions for which a person can be charged if they don't agree with it. For example, one of the other parts of social principles is opposition to capital punishment. But there is no legislation in the discipline that tries to make that juridical so that a pastor who disagrees with the social principles can be brought up on charges. Or a person, I happen to strongly support the position of the social principles against capital punishment, and I advocate such. But if I advocated on the other side, the Board of Ordained Ministry, if I'm a member of an annual conference, could not say that's a chargeable offense. But right now, we've taken the social principles and then made legislative, administrative, juridical laws and made chargeable offenses. That if a pastor performs a same-sex union, that's a chargeable offense. That's taking a social principle and making it into an administrative, legislative, juridical charge. That's one of the few, offhand, I can't think of any of the other social principles that we've done that way. Any parts of the social principles we've done that way. Did that help? These are resources for education. They are aspirational. And this is what the General Conference is asked to approve at this time. It may be amended next time. There's also, in the social principles, there's one on marriage. You can read that. It removes the language about same-sex marriages. It removes that prohibition. All of the prohibition language that's currently in the discipline, there are petitions to remove them all. That doesn't mean they will be, but the petitions are there, and there are more petitions calling for that than calling for the retention of the present language. So now this, I encourage you to follow news service, go on the General Conference website, and follow how these are developing as General Conference approaches, because they're still changing, and people are advocating, and there will be people there advocating on both sides of this position. But so I put the website for these new social principles. You can download those, and I would encourage you. There's some wonderful statements there. They're very profound, well thought through statements, and and by the way, there were persons. This position on human sexuality included input from some people, some delegates from Africa. So they were involved in helping. There's also one on polygamy, which is not an issue in the American context, but there is a position it is in the African context. So there is a statement that the Africans say, let's deal with that also. I think I think you'll find the social principles interesting, and I hope you find many of them are inspiring, and they deal with a broad spectrum of issues that are before our society that we desperately need some direction from the church on. So I've mentioned the prohibitions related to human sexuality, that negative language related to LGBTQ persons. There are petitions recommending the removal of all of those negative languages, and that includes prohibiting ordination, same-sex marriage, leaving that. The petitions predominantly say, leave the question to annual conferences as to what the qualifications for their clergy will be. They're the ones that Rebecca and Austin were examined by, and Bill and John. They came through the Board of Ordained Ministry and examined by the Board of Ordained Ministry, and they're the ones who determine the qualifications. There are some in the Book of Discipline, but the annual conference is the one who determines whether someone is to be ordained or not. So let the annual conference make the decision. And also leave it to local churches, as right now policies pertaining to weddings lie in the local church, do they not? I suspect Washington Street has some policies about who can be married here and maybe even how you can decorate the altar. The local church makes decisions about that, and the local pastor determines who to marry and not to marry. It's left to the pastor. Most of the petitions leave it there. Leave it to local churches and pastors on those issues. But it is removal of what is the stigmatized language that's there now. Okay, there will be legislation, and I'll move quickly here. Legislation pertaining to disaffiliations. Paragraph 2553 in the Book of Discipline was added in 2019. It was added to permit, and interestingly, it came out of those supporting the traditional plan that was before the conference, and it was the expectation that if you disagreed over the church's position on homosexuality, that you could disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church on the basis of conscience. And it only identifies one reason for doing that, and that's the conscience on homosexuality. It's been more broadly interpreted, and I believe South Carolina has used a different paragraph and I don't know what the implications will be for that. There's always been that paragraph where a church closes and you can sell their property. That had nothing to do with any of these issues. And apparently that's the paragraph that is being used in South Carolina. But this paragraph, it was a sunset clause in it. They had to go through that process by December of 2023. So there are no longer churches that can disaffiliate under this paragraph, because this paragraph is no longer void. I mean, no longer, it's void now. You understand that? But there are many who want this paragraph to be reinstated or continued so that disaffiliations can continue. What this paragraph allowed, which was new in our history, it meant that a local church could sell its own property. The trust clause has been in the deeds of Methodist churches since John Wesley and the deed of foundry. And that was put aside for the purpose of conscience on homosexuality. And some churches have disaffiliated, many in South Carolina, although in South Carolina, officially they haven't disaffiliated. They've closed and reopened under another denomination. That's unique in South Carolina, I believe. I don't know that there are others, conferences that have done that. So we don't see that, but there have been some 7,000 churches plus who have disaffiliated across the denomination. There have been an additional 1,800 to 2,000 churches that have closed. Now that's not so abnormal. Every annual conference closes churches because their members have moved away and they're discontinued. So we are about 9,000 churches fewer than we were in 2019. But there are those going to be at General Conference who have announced. There are two groups who are advocacy groups, and they are continuing to encourage local churches to disaffiliate. They have announced, I'm not saying anything confidential, they have announced that two of them, groups, are going to be at General Conference urging that we continue this disaffiliation option with churches taking their property. And they are still advocating that they will attempt to recruit congregations from the United Methodist Church. Now, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you in my opinion on that. I think that's disingenuous, and I question the ethics of it. As one friend of mine said, don't burn down the barn while you're leaving it. But I respect people who have differencing of conscience. I grieve divisions in our church. I think it grieves the heart of God. I think Jesus is weeping because his prayer, one of his last prayers in the book of John, that they will be one. And we need to be moving toward oneness, not toward scattering. And we are damaging our witness to the world. We are acting like the polarized political agenda of our society, right at the time that the world needs a community that can say, we don't have to agree to love one another. John Wesley's dictum, though we may not think alike, can we not love alike, is so needed. And I can't imagine Jesus being happy with our saying, because we can't agree on human sexuality, we can't worship together or serve together in the same congregation and bear witness. But now I'm going to preaching, or maybe even meddling with some. Well, it's ministers but churches are part of those, and pastors have an enormous. Just said, what about? I've talked about churches. What about pastors? Pastors are as divided as churches are, and that's a judgment on we pastors too. And I think we're in a. Well, I'm getting too much editorial, but I yes. Okay, take it to yes. Yeah, I'm sorry if I'm not paying attention up there from.
My correction was, when a minister, does he turn in his credentials? Does he, what is his status?
Okay, credential. If a church disaffiliates or leaves the United Methodist Church, the pastor has to make the decision: do I go with that local church, or do I stay and do I surrender my credentials and stay in the United Methodist Church? That would be my understanding, John. Yes, Austin.
We do have an online question from Laurie in Taylor, South Carolina, and she said, if the social principles wording read by you passed, what would have to then be done to allow gay pastors and marriages?
Unless there's some other petitions that address that, and there may be, and so I can't answer definitively, but my sense is that the decision regarding marriage would be left to the pastors. I don't know that would answer the question. And annual conferences could make those decisions. They might have an expectation that they would communicate with the pastors, but the language specifically prohibiting in the petitions that I've read, the language prohibiting it would be removed, and it would be left to decisions in local churches and pastors, would be my assumption, and annual conferences. But at the general conference level, there would not be that statement. Yeah. Yes. Yes. That's right. And look, I've made lots of appointments as I was a bishop of 3 annual conferences, and I made a lot of pastoral appointments. We try to. Every bishop I know tries to make appointments on the basis of the needs and compatibility of a pastor with a congregation. And just because, even if the General Conference allows, there's still a lot of consultation that's going on, and the questioner is right, or the comment is right. People have to acknowledge that I think we're creating a problem that isn't a problem. We're speculating that this is going to happen. I don't see it happening in South Carolina. know a lot of LGBTQ people who are trying to get into South Carolina. Yeah, thankful, and I'm thankful for that. What I'm trying to say is, it's not as though somehow, by removing this, that every local church is going to be confronted with this issue. Yes, ma'am. Back here.
If the petition to allow gay marriage goes through and it was supported, so if a preacher in a church in South Carolina decided not to do that, as a gay person, could you bring that as a petition, as you did with the child, make a charge against that church? Is that a crazy question?
I'm not sure I understand the question. That if
Say if it passes, the language is taken out, and it's passed that it's now preachers can conduct gay marriages in a church. It's in there. So if I was a member of a church and I wanted to get married in that church, and the preacher refused to marry me, even though it's no longer in the discipline, could I then take a charge against that preacher? Becky's shaking her head. I know I wouldn't have to do that with you, Becky, but
you could not bring a charge against that, but you could complain.
I could
to the district superintendent and the bishop and to whoever, and you could even write a petition asking the general conference to make it illegal to refuse.
That was in my first question. Is could I then write a petition,
yes,
take to Becky, and then she would hopefully do what you did and bring it all the way to the...
Yes.
Okay. That was really the question that I was asking.
It seems to me that would open a whole new can of worms, though, in the sense that right now it's left to pastors to have the authority to marry or not marry whomever. You know, the gayness never enters into it. You know, I could just be counseling with somebody and say, those folks are not compatible. I'm not doing that wedding or that marriage. Mm-hmm. No, right. Well, but I'm saying that, you know, right now the authority of who you marry and who you don't, outside the question of homosexuality, is left to the pastor anyway. Isn't that correct?
Yeah. Yes, that's true. Just another comment, and it's more editorial from my perspective. I think we've got to get away from legislation as the way we handle our disagreements. Legislation, I think we need to do less legislating, not more. Because every time we legislate, we create winners and losers. And we've forgotten how to persuade. I think persuasion, when we legislate, and I've said this in many settings, of all people, the church shouldn't be trusting legislation more than liturgy. But we have more confidence in the law than to say, well, there ought to be a law against. It used to be that the doctrine and discipline of the United Methodist Church could be carried in the pockets of circuit riders, about the size of my cell phone, a little more. Because we didn't legislate on every matter, but we persuaded. I think when we legislate, it's a power play. When we need to, and it avoids relationships rather than, if we're going to legislate, let's legislate we stay together and work this out. You know, let's hammer it out together. There's a wonderful, my church history professor, Dr. C.C. Gowen, wrote a book entitled Broken Churches, Broken Nation, denominational schisms and the coming of the American Civil War. And he contended that the churches, mainline churches, divided. We divided in the 1840s, 15 to 20 years before the Civil War. He speculates that if the churches could have stayed together, maybe the Union could have stayed together. But we went the way of the nation and started legislating again on slavery, dividing on slavery, and when legislation didn't work any longer, we succumbed to violence. I'd say let's get to know people. Let's really practice that everybody is a beloved child of God made in the divine image. That our identity lies in the one to whom we belong. And we belong to God, who loves us all equally, and in whom there is no division of male and female, bond or free, Greek, Gentile, or Jew, but all are one. How do we live that out? General Conference will not pass legislation that'll make us live that out, because we can't be made to live it out. We've got to freely choose it. But that's the choices we need to make. Let me, maybe we could come back after the General Conference and we could discuss this issue and what happens at the General Conference on this issue. Because Washington Street, you've been a beacon of light to others in the community. And so the General Conference isn't going to take your witness away. In fact, I think it's going to maybe reflect the power of your witness and the witness of churches like you over the conference. Okay, gosh, I have gone too long. Oh yeah, way too long. The budget, the budget's going to have the proposed budget is a 42% decrease. That's a huge decrease, reflecting the number of churches that have left and the financial resources. What that will mean to local churches will yet to be determined. But well, okay, how can you influence it? Let me just quickly, can I just name these? You know how you can. Be informed on the issues, and I've listed some of the websites you can access. So be informed on those. Watch out for that disinformation and guard against it. Just because somebody writes and says it doesn't mean it's accurate. Go to these documents, the advocate, the minutes of the meetings. Listen to the live streaming. General Conference is going to be live streamed, the plenary sessions. You can listen to the debates, and you can even download the Daily Christian Advocate, and that even is a verbatim of what's happening. So you can read what's happened on every day. Contact your South Carolina delegates. That's on your website or on your sheet. You can attend as a visitor. It's only an hour and a half up there, isn't it? Go up and watch it. You can visit, and you go through the front door and they may check some security, but anybody can visit. Anybody can visit. You can't visit the bar of the conference, but that'll be set. The bar of the conference is the official seating capacity. Methodists don't have a bar at the conference. But it's close, so go visit, or if you can't, live stream. Watch the legislative committees. You, I think, can visit the legislative committee. You can go in and watch the legislative committee work. Remain hopeful. And I say that not as just superficial. The hope of the church is not in any meeting. The hope of the church is in what God has already done in Jesus Christ. God in Jesus Christ has already won the decisive victory, and the church is of God and will be preserved to the end of time. The reign of God is the focus, not the institutional church. The primary focus is the reign of God. God's reign of justice, compassion, generosity, joy, and hope and peace. That's God's dream for the world. And God's dream is going to come true because God has already in Jesus the Christ won that decisive victory in the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. And therefore we can live now in the light of God's dream for the world, which is that there will be neither Jew nor Gentile, male nor female, but all will be one. And just remember, Jesus only left one command with his disciples. Love one another as I have loved you. And if we'll just stay focused on that, all is well and all will be well. So God bless you. Keep perspective. Keep doing what you're doing. Love one another, because no act of love is ever wasted. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Carter, very much. And thank you all for being here, and all of you who've been watching us online. And we will take you up on your offer to come and be with us again after General Conference. For those of you who want to travel to Charlotte for General Conference, if you want to reach out to either me or Austin and let us know, and we'll see if we can get groups of us going up there together. And certainly, let's all continue to be in prayer for all of the delegates and all of the conversations that are going on already, as well as for all of the lobbyists who will be there and the different methods of people reaching out to those delegates to influence their votes. And put your brains together on ways that we can be positive influences and encouragers for our delegates. I really believe that the delegates and Bishop Carter and John Culp and anybody who's been a delegate has shared with me how long those days are and how exhausted they are and how emotionally drained they are from all of the conversations. So any ways that we can be encouragers and supporters, sharing love and encouragement with our delegates, I'm sure they will definitely appreciate. So let me close us with a word of prayer. If you'll bow with me. Dear God of hope and strength, as we gather together as your holy church, we give you thanks that you have won the victory. And we give you thanks that your Son, Jesus Christ, modeled for us the way of love. So continue to give us the courage and the faith that we need to continue to walk in his way of life. Bless the delegates who gather together at General Conference with your wisdom and with your compassion and with your vision for your kingdom to be on earth as it is in heaven. And bless each one of my siblings gathered here in this sanctuary tonight, that they may continually feel your strength and your love supporting them and guiding them each day. For it is in Jesus' power-filled, holy, and loving name that I offer this prayer. Amen.